So Andre, in some ways you have in front of you and who you've assembled a classic private sector fund, albeit with a big impact focus and lens, an organization which is an NGO that has morphed into a private sector fund that helps to deliver its function, and then an international finance institution. And if you believe that markets are perfectly efficient and frontier markets present an enormous amount of opportunity, why isn't this just self-correcting? Why do we need the WEF to gather a bunch of do-gooders together to come to the conduit to talk about this?
These are pioneers, and I mean that in the sense that I think for years, this is not a new discussion, and it's not necessarily that the contexts are not less complex. It's a messy world, as we heard from the discussions today, but I think what I come out of today's discussion is there's actually a lot of things happening. And I think what we're missing is that there isn't necessarily a convergence of these communities coming together to inform who has done what and who has, at their disposal the kind of tools, projects, finance that can drive different solutions. When we started our humanitarian resilience investing initiative a couple of years ago, we launched this in Davos in 2019. It was sort of at an interesting moment of kind of three trends, if I can say. And one was, which I think was pivotal, was the push within the humanitarian ecosystem to look at innovative ways to deploy new capital. I think the ICRC with their Humanitarian Impact Fund that allowed for private sector participation, that allowed donors to take a different approach of how they utilize their resources, even in some cases change their laws as a result, to be able to support that, were first sort of steps into that. But I think they were matched with a push that has accelerated since of the development finance community to look at stronger presence in fragile contexts. IFC is the leading example of that. And we were, I think, through some of the convenings that we organized, increasingly contacted by different types of investors that were trying to understand how to deploy their capital for greater good, but didn't necessarily understand how this conversation doesn't go beyond charity or philanthropy. That part is critical, but I think it allowed us to start to say, well, as the forum, we can provide that safe space. We don't have a specific agenda to drive in that, but we saw a gap in terms of some of the communities that were talking at each other but not together yet. And then over the years, we tried to put in, I would say, both communities and structures to inform that discussion around concrete projects, around some of the key entrepreneurs that are leading the way within these organizations. And frankly, I think we're also at a time where the pressures to deploy grant capital, concessionary capital, there's a feeling that is starting to run out. It's starting to plateau. But I think with some in this sector, there's still a misperception of what the role of the private sector is, and frankly, who the private sector is. And I think the group that we were able to assemble today were different types of investors. There were development finance institutions and I would say even different types of foundations. There are others that I can speak to in terms of who have been convening, but we felt it was really important to see what's the potential of this kind of a group coming together. But I think equally important to capture the work that they've done, but to align on some of the key messages that can be delivered to donors, to humanitarian agencies, to governments that are trying to solve these problems and have a bit more of a cohesive message to them as well.
So that's very helpful as a framing device. And Runa, I want to now turn to you. You wouldn't have been able to raise 3.2 billion in capital if investors didn't A, trust you to deploy it, but B, didn't see the enormous, perhaps underappreciated opportunity in the markets that you're going to work in. So let's presume that there is an underappreciated risk. That's where people go and make money, where there's underappreciated risk. What makes your work more difficult given where you've chosen to deploy capital? And what are the sorts of things that a group like this can help correct for that can ensure that they're not just one of you, but 10 or 15 or 20 of you? Because that's a sort of broad goal that we're wanting to move towards.
Yes, it would be great if there were 50 You know, it would be great to have a whole ecosystem. So your first question to Andre, the problem is still there. There's still jobs to be created, companies to be created, development in these countries, especially also with climate change coming, you know, taking people into poverty again. So there's a great need there. I'll answer your question by thinking about the investor ecosystem. So the ecosystem starts first, you need money. It is very, very difficult to raise money for Africa and many of the emerging markets. Part of that is there is a perception gap, perception versus reality. And it's very hard even to get into the offices for some fund managers of pension funds, endowments, et cetera, et cetera. Private equity in Africa was started by the development institutions like the IFC because there was no private sector money available. And we were told at the beginning, let's make money. There has to be a demonstration effect, and then we'll bring in the private sector. 24 years later, we're still supported by the development institutions. There are pension funds and sovereigns and endowments in the mix, but not enough. And for new investors, it's very hard to raise money. So the perception gap is big. And so we need to all convene to see how to change that. Then you go into the investing side. And there has to be expertise built up over years because our markets are different. We have issues with devaluations, foreign exchange, the way the companies work, you know, bringing in our, you know, expertise in governance and various different things. So there has to be expertise built up over many years. And with that expertise, the trust comes from the private sector to invest. And bottom line is the track record. So then we have to exit. We have to attract more people into our regions to buy companies as they grow larger. So there is a lot of work over many years. We are doing the work. There are many investable funds and many investable companies, and that's the perception gap. And part of the convening is to get that message out to parts of the world and investors who don't know that. They're investable companies, investable funds, and investable regions. And that's what's needed now.
So let me dig into that for a moment. Let's bracket off all the specific and peculiar risks in the markets that you're operating. FX devaluation, governance, certainty, rule of law, conflicts, disproportionate climate impact. You could list a lot, right? And I'm sure every kind of jaded New York pension fund manager who's about to allocate capital to you is going to ask all of those questions before they give you a penny. But before they do that, they've got to answer, there's a prior question, which is, okay, where's the money to be made? Like, where is the enormous opportunity? So for those people who are unfamiliar, who just don't fully appreciate that there is an enormous amount of investment level return to be made in these markets, do the 3-minute pitch. Like, where is the money to be made in these markets?
Well, let's start with the big secular trends. Africa's population average age is 19.5 years. By 2050, 1 out of every 5 people in the world will be Africans. It's also where huge urbanization is taking place. Around the same time frame, about half of the world's biggest cities will be in Africa. Then you look at digitization. Yes, during COVID, a lot of companies digitized, brought down, you know, their costs, easier to get customers, grew their gross margin. In Africa with very little legacy, it's huge. So instead of credit cards, phones that are credit cards. Instead of a lot of things, they're digital solutions. And our VC industry in Africa is all about getting goods and services to people who didn't have them before. Unblocking development, which means the business plans are very, very sticky. Companies are not going away. Many of the companies are becoming profitable very quickly. So when you take the huge trend of a huge consumer class building up, along with digitization, the macro is telling you there is something big there. There is something very big there. Then you take it down to the entrepreneurship that is in Africa, who are building unicorns in the VC space, very large multi-country companies, many of which we've invested in. You know, one of the newest unicorns in the whole world is MTN, which is an Egyptian company. It's one of our portfolio companies. A few years ago, they were leasing tuk-tuks and writing loans by hand. They're now fully a fintech company. And then you have companies that have built Pan-African, multiple country, large multinationals. You know, there are many of those. And so there are actual companies that are there and actual trends that would lead an investor to say, we have to look at these regions. We have to do something there. There's a lot there.
Okay, last question, then I'm going to go on, move down the panel. Distill down the three biggest sources of skepticism and risk. Where is it that cause people to say, I accept everything you've just said, I'm still not going to do it? Why?
Well, the world has moved in a way that 65% of private capital for funds comes out of the U.S. When you have a U.S. stock market that's rising 10 to 20% a year, you have no FX risk. It's your domestic market, you know it. So why would you go abroad? But I would argue today, those things, you know, one of the things about investing is having a portfolio or a hedged approach. So today, when this run has been so long, interest rates are going up, and at the same time, you know, you have very overvalued companies still. It's time to look elsewhere. We are able to invest in some of the real blue chip companies that our biggest growth per year was 123% a year. But there are many companies that are growing 20, 30% that we're investing. When you look at multiples, EV, EBITDA of 7 times, and a comparable company in the West would be 15 times. There is a financial opportunity there. So comparing domestic markets to some of our markets, it's now maybe time to have another look. And then when you combine the long-term that I said, long-term secular trends, it's also a medium and long-term investment to be in these markets now. Of course, there is fundamental skepticism in terms of what Andre mentioned, rule of law, corruption, you know, problems of devaluations in many markets. The currency only goes down. It doesn't go up against the dollar, but not all markets. In Africa, there are regions like Francophone West Africa where the inflation is low, the currency is stable, and in Algeria, the currency went up last year. So bottom line is that skepticism is there. The only way to overcome that is actual returns, combined with also impact, because the impact world is growing and people want returns if they get impact in addition. That's not a bad investment proposition. So, and with regard to those corruption, all the usual things we get asked, the way to show that you overcome that is to be in this world and show investment over many years where you don't have those things. In Africa, there are many companies, it's called the new generation managers, you know, who are not corrupt, who do, you know, things by rule of law, incredible expertise, incredible entrepreneurship, and, you know, giving us returns and our investors returns. So those all exist. You have to just show them. You have to show that. That's the only way to overcome those objections.
Awesome. So from the abstract to the particular, Gary, you are an example of an NGO turned into a fund to seek to amplify and accelerate your mission. And when people are going, well, I'm happy to kind of make a donor contribution to water.org, but I'm going to be much more forensic in thinking about what I give to water equity. Do your pitch for water equity. Firstly, how are you going to get your money back? And then once you get your money back, how is it that getting your money back is going to achieve its impact?
Great questions. And I was hoping to take a bite at that question, like how are you going to get your money back that you asked? It all starts like with any business. You have to create value somewhere, right? And for us, that value creation happens at a household level for, you know, in a low-income country where, you know, a woman is spending hours every day collecting water, or she's spending up to 25% of her income to buy water from a water vendor in an urban area because there are no places to walk to collect water. So that's a huge cost to her, both in terms of cash or opportunity cost. Those hours she spent collecting water, she could be working at a paying job. Today alone, women will spend 200 million hours walking to collect water. So the value that that woman gets, if she takes out a small loan from one of our financial partners, we have about 150 around the world now, she can take out a loan for a few $100s and get a water connection, for example, at her house. And literally overnight, she has value creation. A woman that I met in the Philippines in a slum there did just that. She took out a loan, and prior to her loan and getting a water connection, she was paying $2 a day to the water vendor who would come around and sell water in her slum. $60 a month that she was paying because she couldn't afford that lump sum payment up front to get the connection. So after that, her loan payments were $5 a month for 2 years, and now her water tariff is $5 a month. She put $50 back into her pocket. So you multiply that by 740 million people who don't have access to water, and the value that that can create for them, that answers your question. The question is, how do you connect that person to the global capital markets? That's where all the financial plumbing comes in. So we're financial plumbers, basically, with water.org and Water Equity to create that plumbing that makes that work. So our financial partners, get a return on that microloan. They get an interest rate on that, a little bit of profit. We at Water Equity are now lending to those financial institutions around the world. So when they get repaid, we get repaid. We do tranches, ticket sizes of $2 to $10 million with these financial institutions. And then once we get repaid, then our investors get repaid. There's enough value creation to carve off a little bit and pass it up the chain so that we can now match the capital markets with this. And that's why our funds now are able to provide competitive financial returns to investors while also literally helping millions of people get access to water and sanitation.
It's a conduit audience, so we can geek out a bit. So I want to sort of dig in at one further level, if you don't mind. I get and everybody will intuitively say there's a de facto water tax imposed on women who have to go and spend that amount of money going to go and get water. And if you can make the economics work in the way that you've described, there's a huge saving to those women, and women are super bankable, right? From Grameen Bank down and back and forward, we know this. So the intermediary step, I think, is worth exploring. It is, how do you finance the delivery of the water connection to women such that there's enough money to be able to do it and finance it and produce the return? So do that little piece, expand on your anecdote.
So the secret of this is that women make these decisions on their own to take out a loan. No one's going to take out a loan for a water improvement that they don't feel is going to add to the value of their life. So they don't do that otherwise. But then how do they connect to the infrastructure if there is no infrastructure? Is that kind of, well, you've just introduced our next fund. So we've been working with financial institutions to do this and investing debt into them so that they can scale this up massively. But now what we're going to be doing, and we're going to be launching at the United Nations General Assembly, UNGA, in September, an infrastructure fund. And that will actually raise debt and equity capital so that in fact, that will actually just be straight up equity, so that we can then work with utilities, work with companies that provide water and sanitation services to low-income populations, so that we can work with them to build out the infrastructure into some of the slums so that there are systems to connect to. So now we're looking at this from that bottom-up capital investment at the household level and also top-down so that the facilities are there.
I mean, if you abstract for a moment, and then, Jumoke, I'm going to come to you, because in a way what your story tells is that when the poor are unbanked, and the poor don't have access to capital, don't have title to land, don't have access to credit, don't have access to infrastructure, you get into the doom loop of a poverty trap. But the poor are much more resourceful and resilient than everybody thinks. And a little bit of infrastructure, which has happened in developed economies a long time back, and then the flywheel of that infrastructure produced the wealth that everybody takes for granted in developed economies, is the breakdown. And if you can just insert the infrastructural point together with certainty, good governance, the rule of law, peace and stability, none of which are given, but if you can do that, in fact, the poor generate circumstances which help people into circumstances of self-sufficiency surprisingly quickly. And so I guess this is a perfect sort of segue into the work of the IFC, right? Because in a way, that might be a somewhat longer than you would want strapline for your mission, which is to enable that capital to get to places that the capital for some reason is not flowing. So do you want to talk a little bit about what it is that you're trying to solve for and how the combination of Gary and Runa's work is facilitated by what you're trying to do?
Okay, I'll use two examples. One in northwest Kenya in a refugee area, and something else that we're trying to do in post-conflict or conflict-affected areas with domestic private sector. So using the example in Kakuma. Kakuma is one of the largest camps, refugee camps in Kenya, in northwest Kenya. And when we first started looking at this in 2016, together with UNHCR, the refugee agency, nobody realized, even we did not realize how large a market there was. So we did a study which is called Kakuma as a marketplace. It suddenly threw up to everyone that the refugees, the host community, together created, and what they bought and sold and what was going on economically within that community made that community the 7th largest city in Kenya. But this was all informal. Nobody knew about it. No services were being provided. There was no bank in the community. And so that's fast forward to now where a number of banks have gone there, identifying that there is the opportunity for banking, for trade and things like that. There are a couple of infrastructure firms that have gone there to provide solar systems. Right now, the grid is about 250 kilometers. The electricity grid is about 250 kilometers long, circling the entire neighborhood. And this electricity grid only started 3 years ago. In addition, we also then created, used donor financing and work with others to create a challenge fund where people who went to Kakuma 7 years ago and went to Kakuma last year, there are a number of the host community and refugees are beginning to see business start up. There are restaurants where people are actually choosing what they eat. And one of the refugees has set up a cyber cafe. You know, little things like that you would be normal elsewhere would not have happened without services coming there. They did not have a pharmacy in that area until last year. So those are things that you can look at from an impact point of view. And without the groundwork of pulling the studies together, making sure that the economic analysis is right, people would not have taken that analysis seriously, and the capital that then went along would not have gone there. The second example I will use is in fragile and conflict-affected countries. In countries where there have been either war or as recovering from war, what you find is you have the domestic private sector that when there is a crisis, the foreign direct investment is no longer there, has left. And the jobs that are created, the jobs that are created go with those investments leaving. And so one of the things we're trying to do is to actually work with partners to see how we can build up the capacity of the domestic private sector to grow, to create the jobs that are necessary, and to also then ensure that help take them up to from an environmental and social and governance point of view, build the standards up from where they are currently to what you would call best in class, world-class standards, so that when the foreign direct investment or foreign partners do come in, they do actually find partners, local partners that they can work with, who are more resilient, and they can, whether by themselves, the domestic players, or together with international partners, can then move next door to the next country and things like that. Because without growing the domestic private sector, I'm looking at Africa specifically, and it can also work in other regions. Without growing the domestic private sector, it would be very, very difficult to say we are actually able to grow increase the inclusivity of the economy.
So I found your first example incredibly compelling because we at the Conjured are doing a ton of work on refugees. We're holding a major conference in February on refugee integration and settlement and exploring all the different ways in which refugees are enormous assets to communities and the kind of technologies that allow refugees to be net contributors to their host countries. So this is I've just got you as an example for our conference, so thank you. So that seems very intuitive. And I can sort of see an IFC coming in and going, there isn't a bank, let's try and set up a financial infrastructure. There needs to be a grid. Let's leapfrog and find ways of financing or supporting a grid. And a grid is an analog to what Gary does in electricity, and Gary comes and does the water, and then you come in and invest. That all makes sense. The conflict, rule of law, corruption angle, all too easily, pointed at frontier markets. Let's just think a little bit where corruption exists in the world for a moment, and let's not point out frontier markets. It's rampant in developed economies as well. It's just called something different. But let's, for the bracket, just say, to be honest, it does exist and is a real problem. Does the IFC try and solve for that in any way? And I'm going to come to you, and I suspect that also some of the kind of fragility conflict stuff will ping back to Andre. But how do you solve for that? That seems thornier to me.
It is. It's a thorny question. It's a thorny issue. You sort of have to separate the wheat from the chaff. There are people who, in conflict, would have had to do things that they would not normally do in order to get ahead. But there are people who, even if there was no conflict, they would do it anyway. And so you need to decide, is this player the former or the latter? Have they did this at the time? Do they not do it again? How do you identify the character of the player you're getting into bed with, getting into marriage with, whatever analogies you want to use? We need to identify that. That is crucial. And we spend a lot of time to do that. But you can only know that if you have people on the ground. You can't fly in and fly out and know who they are. And so part of the way we're working is actually to have boots on the ground. Boots on the ground can help you identify, will know, this guy, no. This guy is always trying to do the right thing. He did this, he did that, but it was in this context, And since that ended, he has stopped doing that. And the guys or gals who actually want to do the right thing see us as cover for the parties who still want to behave in the corrupt manner, whatever. They know that everybody knows that IFC doesn't play that game. And so they know that if they tell the parties, oh no, IFC is I have a loan from IFC, or I'm talking to IFC, I can't do that, otherwise they won't. They know that they will back off if they know that IFC is with them. So they see us as some sort of insurance for it. And that is something, but it is really, really important to identify the good guys or girls and the bad guys or girls, and keep away from those who would continue to do that.
I would just add a couple of examples where we organized an event in February looking at collaboration between development finance institutions and humanitarians. And I think it really spoke to a trend that we're seeing about the kind of partnerships that are being built. I think there are a number of these players that are increasing footprint in these contexts, but there are agencies that have been there for decades in some cases, right? They're integrated and infused with the local communities. They understand the local dynamics. So I think what we're seeing is that there's increasing space for partnerships for those that have been there for a long time that can help navigate. A good example is the partnership between the ICRC and the World Bank in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Goma, where ICRC for decades have been trucking water. They're now trying to move that into supporting infrastructure development by partnering with the players like the World Bank. They're doing that as a potential model for an ICRC way of doing things on water. I think the question then is how far can they go for a player like Water.org and Water Equity to start to collaborate on that. So I just wanted to add that and we're seeing this with EBRD and the International Rescue Committee in Jordan and a number of other examples. So even in difficult places, that collaboration happens, but it's complex, it takes time, it takes trust, and I think it takes pioneers within and entrepreneurs within these organizations to say, we're going to do this a little bit differently. I'm going to use some of my political capital to push for that because I think it's going to show us a different approach. But I just wanted to add that when we started a lot of our discussions, I think the assumption was, we just need to bring private capital into this space, right? And I think what we clearly saw at moments, many times, is that different types of investors, corporates, others, I think are very open to understand how they can help solve the problem. I think more so sometimes than others that have been, if I can say, deeply entrenched in that space for reasons of trying to solve for those challenges. But I think we're seeing also the importance of the change that needs to happen in kind of the traditional aid model, right? So I think, we had in Davos in January the head of USAID saying that the current model as it exists is not sustainable. Now, we can use that as a pressure point and leverage it in a certain direction, but I think there's recognition that just adding more players into that space is not going to do it, even if that brings more capital. I think what we need to see is earlier planning with those that understand the context, but with a long-term view, right? So that we are guided by the kind of impact that needs to reach those communities, but understand that there needs to be a business model and sustainable approach to be able to ensure long-term perspective. That's not relevant for all places, but I think what examples like Kakuma is showing, even as the government of Kenya is starting to open up their policies on refugees in terms of potential freedom of work and freedom of movement, it starts to create economic hubs. And I think that will also pinpoint a change of the relationship of the humanitarian development community vis-a-vis places like Kakuma that have been there for a very long time.
I'd like to ask, from your perspective, how much time you spend thinking about stability and governance versus the actual deal-by-deal analysis. Because in some ways, going to invest in a battery factory in northern Norway, I'm spending zero time thinking about governance, and I'm thinking about batteries, right? So how much of your mind share goes to a question which in some ways you want to kind of solve away from in order to accelerate capital flows?
That's a very good question. So when we think about investing, we're lucky that we have all of Africa to think about. That includes 54 countries. And regions are different. It's a continent. So, during Arab Spring, we were not investing in North Africa, but we had the rest of sub-Saharan Africa to invest in. During the commodity cycle downturn 2016, there are many commodity exporting countries we were not investing, but there was the rest of Africa. So we do spend time thinking about where we want to invest, when we want to get in, when we want to come out, country by country and region by region. It's always there. That being said, we would not take investor money unless we thought we could invest it despite all those things. And we wouldn't have spent all these years being able to invest successfully and exit successfully without having a real understanding of what to do with companies during downturns. And the biggest thing I will say about that is our companies themselves and the management teams. So I get asked, there was COVID, there was the war in Ukraine, inflation globally. Aren't your companies really worried, and how are they doing? Well, I will say they're doing really well. And you know why? Because they deal with inflation all the time. They deal with downturns all the time. They deal with all sorts of situations that somebody in the Nordic countries don't have to deal with. So you get very, very experienced entrepreneurs, very experienced management teams. And the main thing is they don't think it's the unexpected. They're not thrown, they're not deer in headlights. And the number of times we've seen where there's a very bad situation. I mean, you take Egypt, great devaluation these days, and back in 2016, lots of inflation, lots of problems. Our companies, they were growing at 40% a year because these are experts in bad situations and bad times. And the other thing is, going back to the secular trends, when you have products and companies where demand outstrips supply, so consumer products from a bank account to generic pharmaceuticals to a quick service restaurant, there is increasing growth in demand, and our companies are in that space. They're consumer-facing companies. So when you have that demand combined with experienced management, they are going to do well.
Gary, I want to take the conflict question to another level with your work, which is very often people will frame an investment decision as, well, what happens when conflict happens and it rips up that infrastructure, destroys a company, or thereby jeopardizes my investment? But I suspect when it comes to water, there's almost the precise opposite story to be told, that water builds development, links communities together, creates greater reliance, greater interdependence. And have you seen in your work, through either of your hats, through .org or through Equity, the kind of capacity of water to create greater stability in communities rather than the opposite?
Yes, I mean, I was just in Kenya a few weeks ago and saw exactly that with communities that are coming together that have a water supply for themselves, but the pump breaks down, right? And they need that $5,000 in capital to replace the pump, or they need to serve more members of the community because it's growing, so they need another water tower. And so what they have done is kind of banded together as communities to go out and seek loans to make this happen. Unfortunately, we've been partnering with a bank there called Family Bank, and Family Bank has been doing these micro loans for water and sanitation at the household level, but now they're also moving into this small and medium enterprise lending area. So what we do is work with them, providing technical assistance, like how do you assess a water system and its viability and what's the right pump and things like that. So our technical assistants can help them develop the expertise that they need to then create these loans so that the communities can come together and solve the problems on their own. And I think it's just a really great example of seeing people. And I think this is kind of a theme that runs through this, right? Seeing people living in poverty not as a charity problem to be solved, but as a market to be served. And if we can just change our mindset and not assume from the outset that it's going to be all about philanthropy. And I still run a water NGO, but there's 1,000 water NGOs or more out there. And frankly, the mindset still is this is a charity problem, and this is how we're going to solve the problem. But we know there's never going to be enough charity in the world to get everybody water and sanitation, so we have to have a different mindset. We have to, suspend disbelief that poor people can be a part of the solution. And I think that's what we're trying to do, whether it's investors or others who like kind of put Africa all in one bucket, like, okay, it's like poverty beyond control and there's no market there, there's no investing there. They have to suspend disbelief to come in. But then what we have to do is pay off. We have to perform, right? That's the next step. And I think that's what we've tried to do. We've built the evidence base that people living in poverty will repay these loans. By the way, the loan repayment rate is 98% for women that take out these loans. So, like I said, we had $4 billion in churn in these microloans. So we help them suspend disbelief by going out and proving that poor women are good credit risk. And then the investment started to come in. But now what we have to do is continue to pay off and meet the investment returns that are expected and that we are saying we can deliver. All of that thing leads to this self-reinforcing cycle of, yes, you can connect women making $6 a day with an investor in Kansas City where our headquarters is.
So if you hear the story, right, a sidebar is one of the biggest problems in developing economies to the rapid uptake of renewables is literally gridlock, but not the kind of gridlock you think, is that we don't have enough grids to be able to take wind and solar into a lot of markets because we have regulatory ossification, we have incumbents who have captured the grids. The grids are old, archaic, and linear. They aren't sophisticated and smart. And so now we have wind and solar in some parts of the world that is sitting idle, waiting to be connected to the grid. And you've got literally years and years and years of waiting for a grid to come online to be able to take the renewables that are going to save the world. In these markets, you go, there's a refugee camp. We're going to do water. Water is a form of a grid. It's a utility. We're going to leapfrog a set of technologies. We're not going to lay down old, silly linear grids. We're going to create much smarter, much more agile grids. We're going to leapfrog to digital technologies and payment systems. Everything becomes fintech. So you have all of these enormous benefits. And if somebody was smart, you would just say, lay down water, lay down electricity, and then invest like mad, because your story of banks, solar systems, challenge funds, restaurants, cyber cafes, pharmacies, everything's investable in order to make that happen, right? So it's super exciting. I get super excited even just telling the story back to you guys. So the question then is, why are we only at, how many funds like you are there investing in Africa? How many?
There are a few.
But how many?
So, of our size, maybe 5, but there are 40 institutionalized funds throughout Africa. Some of them are quite small.
Right. Okay. So in some ways, this comes back to the IFC and comes back to why you're convening this group, right? At this moment in history, we should be crowding this capital in, because if you just let a Gary and a Runa, you guys just go for it, so many of the problems get solved. So how are you going to make it happen quicker?
Okay. Part of the reason it hasn't happened, or it's been slow to happen, is because it is actually very difficult to work in those markets. Lesson has shown us that in such frontier markets in Africa, the deal sizes are usually 3 times smaller than the average across Africa. It typically takes 3 times as long. And because it takes 3 times as long, because security reasons and all that, it's also sometimes 3 or 4 times as expensive. Because it takes long, you've really got to look at patient capital. And until fairly recently, there wasn't that much patient capital, looking around or prepared to wait around to do that. But things are changing in the world, and there is a lot of players are looking to actually have a portion of their investing going into impact investing. And so what we're seeing right now is lots of money chasing very few deals. And so what we all then have to do, starting with us development finance institutions, is working together to actually create the deals that will solve the problems that are in this market. And so I'll use the example of ARIA, which is a coalition of different development finance institutions, who we were competitors, but we have come together to create tools that we can all jointly use, and are actually beginning to advocate together in countries so that governments in those countries understand the conditions that need to be made for private sector activity to take place, and also going on business development trips together. Did it in Sierra Leone, did it in Liberia, and are beginning to look at ways to collaborate to actually increase the pie instead of chasing down, one pie and going taking down to the roots of it. So there's a lot of that is happening. In addition, we are then also talking to, because there are a number of things that need to be paid for that firms like IFC that has a AAA rating and has to maintain a AAA rating because of the demands of our charter and our shareholders, cannot pay for. So I use the example of taking companies from where they are on the ESG, environmental, social, and governance standards, from where they are today to where they should be. Now, somebody's got to pay for taking them to that end. So how can we get the donor governments, donor entities, or philanthropies or foundations to help pay for that? Because that then, once we're able to do that to the ecosystem is then able to attract a lot more capital. Because there is a gap between what the actual risk is, and the perception of risk. If we're able to do quite a bit of that, then the perception of risk goes much closer to the actual risk.
Okay, that's a perfect segue to turn to the audience, because we've been going at it and people, I'm sure, are itching with questions. But I will just, by way of segue, say you said something really, really interesting, is that there's more money than there is deal flow, which is that's a very interesting inversion of what the usual idea is, right? There's thousands of deals and there's not enough money. If there's enough money and not enough deal flow, it kind of makes the TA kind of work that water.org does really important to create the enabling conditions, to create the investable deals. So, okay, questions? Julian. And here comes the mic.
Yeah, actually, I'd just like to pick up on what you were just saying about too much money chasing too few deals. That may be at the infrastructure side of things. On the startup side, you have the more traditional problem where there's a lot of deals and it's difficult to raise money. There's sort of like a valley of death in which many startups go and never emerge from. And I was wondering what, because, obviously you're talking sort of much bigger projects, what you think about on the startup side of things in terms of what can be done to facilitate that. Like, I'm actually invested in an African startup, and getting additional funding, growth funding, has proven extremely difficult because nobody wants to invest in a company that's headquartered in Africa. So we're probably going to have to relocate to the US. I mean, it's the only way we're going to raise money. But we don't want to do that. So
So Africa, like most continents, is very complicated, and there are many, many ecosystems. So there are places where money's chasing deals, and there are places that there's not enough money, for sure. So we, in our most recent funds, will do maybe 12 to 13 deals. We've looked at 2,000. In your space of venture capital, actually more money came in than private equity money in the VC space over the last 5 years. But that changed because a lot of the money was from other parts of the world. And when things started looking down, they went out. But so there is still more money needed. I will say that the venture capital ecosystem has been interesting in Africa because of the lack of money and the unreliability, because in venture capital, you need to raise money all the time. You don't need to do that necessarily in private equity with profitable companies. So every series, every round, you have to raise money. So what did entrepreneurs do? They started creating companies that turned profitable in venture capital. That's a revolutionary idea because you have giant billions of dollars companies in the US and Europe that will not be profitable, because they're taking over market share. But in Africa, in addition to the stickiness of some of these companies because they're solving huge problems, there's also the mentality that maybe we go cash flow positive a lot sooner. But you're right, one of the things to do to create value for the investor in Africa is maybe move the headquarters of the company because there's a revaluation that takes place. Now, that's not happening a lot. Our companies are created by Africans, for Africans, and they stay there. But there is a thinking that, if we're a multinational company and then all of a sudden, we move our headquarters, maybe we create more value. So that thinking is there.
In the back.
Thank you very much. That was really fantastic, and couldn't agree more about that reassessment of risk, imagined versus real. I think when people start attacking lazily applied discount rates, that's when you might get more capital going in. But it was a question about the title of this seminar. I come from a company that specializes in FX. We redistribute the profits to fund charities and drive economic inclusion for refugees. We've actually just launched a pod in Kakuma, so it's great to hear about that from you. We are seeing through our work a lot of charities trying to move into frontier investment or capital markets products and really sort of moving blindly and in total isolation from others in areas they really shouldn't be doing, sort of microfinance products in emerging markets with no protection on their FX. That's our perspective. But more generally, what do you think can be done to help charities where they don't have to build new edifices and monuments each time they do their own sort of capital markets product? What can we do to help them more generally so this isn't a huge labor every time aid turns into frontier investing?
That's a Gary question.
Yeah, how do we, spur more of what we've done? Because that's literally what we've done as a water NGO. I mean, I talked about suspending disbelief earlier. I mean, a water NGO starting up an asset manager and getting registered with the SEC, you really have to suspend disbelief for that one to make it work. And I don't know. We looked at this in different ways. It's like part of the wisdom was like, no, we should just kind of keep nudging markets. We should get the IFC to kind of do this. We should get the World Bank to do this. We should just shine the light on this market and how it's corrected and let those other financial institutions take it on. But that wasn't in our DNA. I mean, we're social entrepreneurs, and I didn't have enough faith in the system to believe that it was just going to happen if we just keep cajoling people. So I don't think there was any substitute for us just like saying we're going to go do it. Fortunately, we had some philanthropic donors We created what was called a new ventures fund, which is kind of an R&D fund in water.org. And fortunately, we had some great donors like the IKEA Foundation and a number of others who seeded us with that fund, that we were able to then go out and launch this asset manager. It took about over $10 million of philanthropy to kind of get that up and running to the point where, you know, we now have a level of self-sufficiency with our existing portfolio. We're still using philanthropic capital to expand that and to hire out ahead of the curve our infrastructure team around the world so that we can start up with that as well. But, you know, I'm happy to talk to anybody in the NGO world who wants to try to do this, because it isn't easy and you need a lot of philanthropy to jumpstart it.
Go for it, Andrew.
Just very quick, because I think we've seen this trend, you know, like Save the Children has a venture entity that they had to spin out because legally it wouldn't work for it to be integrated. If you look at across the humanitarian agencies, most by now have an innovative finance team. I don't take it as a bad thing, because I think, so I hear your point about, you know, there are certain things that maybe they're not best placed to. So, but the reason for that is that there's a range of perception of what this is as a vehicle, right? For some, this is about innovation, it's about pushing boundaries and about instilling some space within these organizations to claim and prove, based on data, based on some of the deals that they're making, that things can be done differently. For others, it's about resource diversification. We should not be honest about that. So that's fine. I think what we're missing, and part of our efforts, is how do you make sure you integrate the investor perspectives as early on into some of the design phases of the kind of solutions that would work even in these tough markets, and the kind of entrepreneurs that are leapfrogging, that are providing, you know, in the renewable space, in the tech space, very different ways of solving an issue. What we're seeing is a disconnect between donors that are supporting innovation, there are a number of vehicles, with market building, right? So you're kind of creating two camps where there's innovation and the funding that's required to sustain that machinery, but not necessarily a sequencing and a transition of innovative solutions, many of which may fail because they're not built for the market. They're built for a concessionary mindset and a short-term mindset.
There were like three. I'm going to get three questions in quick succession. So 1, 2, and 3. Yeah.
Hello. I'm a trustee of a solar NGO, so similar to, you know, providing water utility. We work in Malawi and Zambia. Off-grid solar, last mile communities, and we're piloting a project where basically providing a whole village with off-grid solar, so households using, you know, solar lamps and all that good stuff. So we're still quite small, so I was just, maybe the question has already been answered in part, but you know, how do you then link, if the economic model is then proven that, you know, it's a sort of sustainable, the community can afford it through microfinancing, etc. Once you prove that, then do you need that innovation funding to scale it up, or, you know, how do we then connect to the big money? And not necessarily for ourselves, but, you know, how do we plug that pilot then, that model into, you know, the, I don't know, World Bank or whoever who can finance it and scale it up across the continent? And is private capital, is there a space for it for those last mile communities? Or is it just more kind of, you know, cities and things? Because last mile is a whole different ballgame. Anyway, thank you.
So just pass it right to the gentleman in front of you. Oh. There we go. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Fiying. I'm a consultant in investment space focusing on ESG and responsible investment. Going back to the topic of Africa and different times when you've alluded to a gap between where the societies are and then what makes them more appealing to outside investors, especially the private sector. We are seeing a lot of growth in public-private partnerships and important infrastructure that could then lead to, you know, opportunities that are growing and then more investable firms, I would say, for the private sector. But who right now are you seeing plugging that gap, and where can private, because I mean, a private equity investor is looking to turn in a profit. You're going to exit at some point, but when it comes to PPP investing, that's a lot long term. But the thing is that then plugging that gap then allows you to go on and do more brilliant things. So I would just like to know your views on who is currently plugging that gap and what is needed to plug those gaps to then put private equity firms in a better position to then raise capital.
And if you don't mind passing to this gentleman over here.
Hello, my name's Adam. I work at London Stock Exchange Group on Middle East and Africa. This is a question for the two women on the panel. Please, could you speak about African capital markets, the discrepancy of private versus public listed markets, and the role of domestic African savers and pension funds in channeling money into both private and public companies. Thanks so much.
Okay, and I think what we're going to do is use this as the last hurrah. So if you can each do the most crisp, perfect answer and then we'll retire and have drinks. So maybe we go from Jamaica.
Okay. I thought he was going to go first, and then I would segue after him.
And you don't have
So I
to
was
try and
preparing
answer all
myself for that.
three. Pick
Okay.
one. Pick one.
So one of the key things that I see is that the transition from PPPs, from public enterprises to purely private enterprises, particularly in the infrastructure space, if the process is not properly done, such that there is knowledge symmetry and capacity symmetry between the government or public entity that is granting the concession and the private lenders or private investor that is taking it on. If that symmetry is not there, then you have an arrangement that will fall flat. There was a question earlier about, do you worry about governments? It will fall flat because when the next government comes in at the next election, everything you've done will be unwound. And so making sure that you, as IFC, what we try to do is to try to ensure that the governments and the investors have all the capital and all the advice that they need and can put together the best lawyers. The governments typically rely on the government lawyers who may not have seen a PPP before, or who maybe have seen one PPP in the last 14 years. And so we try to ensure that they have the same level of capacity, and so that the lawyers can talk to each other at the same level. One of the things that we are also trying to do in that is when we run the bid competitions, using, say, for instance, using a scaling solar example, we try to ensure that the legal agreements are sort of fairly standard, such that people then bid on price, right? And there are no undue negotiations of bid documents after the bid, because that is where a lot of the costs or lawyers' costs that build this on really hang on. And so what then happens is that okay. Can I go on? What you then find is that in using that example, you're able to get things down to ensuring that you can get the best price possible in a fair contract between the government and the sponsor, and that sort of contract lives long and stands up to changing governments, and so that is one way that we can get that to happen.
Gary.
So, off-grid solar. My advice is, our playbook was not to initially create an asset manager as we were trying to prove the model. It was knocking on the doors of local microfinance institutions, local banks, saying, hey, there is something here. This is how value is created in the work that we're doing for these communities and these households. And I think that what we had to do was to sweeten the pot, to say, here's a grant to you to go do the market research, to study what we're doing. And we believe if you do that, you will see the market and start lending. And it took many years of us doing that to make that work. And that's where the secret for us was the local capital markets. That $4 billion in churn, almost all of that so far has been the local capital markets that's lending. And if you are creating value and you can demonstrate that, the markets should respond locally, and then you can go from there. And as quickly on private-public partnerships, water is ripe for this because it is expensive infrastructure to install. And what we see is the public financing not being there, so they'll offer concessions that maybe are 10, 15, 20 years for private companies who come in and expand the grid and run that, and then it can be handed back to local government. And I think that's what we're seeing as potential for us, combined with making the utilities more efficient. The whole concept of non-revenue water is crazy, which means water that gets pumped, treated, and distributed, and 35 to 50% of it's lost in the process. There's low-hanging fruit there to collect more tariffs if you can reduce that non-revenue water, and you have a huge carbon footprint associated with all that water that provides no economic value to anyone. So there's like a win-win in terms of potential carbon credits, as well as getting more water out and making the utilities more efficient through these public-private partnerships that we're looking at.
Awesome. Bruna.
So I'll answer two questions very quickly. In Africa, it's not lost on the governments or on the multilaterals like the African Development Bank, AFRICSIM, et cetera, that there is a huge amount of money in the private sector, trillions, 300 trillion all around the world. So the trend is to put infrastructure into the private sector. There are infrastructure funds that are quite successful, that are raising money, more than one, several of them, and there are entrepreneurs that are creating companies that are in infrastructure. One of the big examples is the Dangote refinery, which is about to open later this year in Nigeria, which will change the terms of trade significantly. Private sector, but huge. So the trend is to go into that area, and there are funds, and it is in the private sector. There have to be, because it's infrastructure, some relationship with the government, whether it's traditional PPE or something else. And there's innovation in that also on both sides, the government and the private sector. With regard to listed funds, the issue that Africa's had, now there are 54 countries and something like 20 stock exchanges, some of which are very small and illiquid. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange is, I think, the last I looked, the 20th largest in the world. So there's quite a lot of liquidity there. The regional stock exchanges, like in West Africa and in Kamesa in East Africa. But the problem that the inflows of capital have had is since 2008 and 2009, if you look generally, and there's exchanges that go up, that go down, there's many exchanges, but generally it's been flat. Whereas in private capital, you can sell without going, exiting on an exchange. You can sell to a strategic. There have been many multinationals outside of Africa, inside of Africa, buying companies, and now from the Middle East. So you can get beyond a flat stock exchange, and that's been the advantage of private capital. The hope is that Africa will have another moment in the sun, like other regions, LATAM, Turkey, et cetera. Hasn't really happened yet. And we do need to grow the stock exchanges and get more capital in. And that is something that we should all focus on, how to tell that story and do that.
Andre.
Just briefly on the solar one, we've been working with 10 ventures over the last 6 months that we sourced through what we call an uplink challenge, and many of them are in this space. So I think it's also about connecting with those that have taken that step Two of these companies, one is Energy, the other one's called Africa Green Tech. Both operate in the Sahel. One is from Mali, the other one is based in Germany, moved now most of their operations into West Africa. So I think it's also about recognizing who's already out there and what's there. One is Metrogrids, another is off-grid containerized solutions. One of them has DFI funding and so on. So I think we're kind of, it's a really fragmented space, right? And part of this effort that we're trying to do is, as just one step, is to recognize and show who's already doing what and at what scale, before we also just say that more money will just solve the problem. And if I can just add, because it's an inspiration I think we're taking, and it's really changed the nature of our convening of our work, with these 10 ventures that we put kind of front and center, we've engaged others. We self-impose all of these framings of fragility, conflict, and I don't want to be naive or come across as naive that this isn't, it's really difficult. But I'll give you two very quick anecdotes. One, we did a convening in September during UNGA last year, and one of the CEOs of a new tech company said, we had this investing in fragile context, and he said, guys, this is bad branding. And I'm not saying that replacing that on its own solves the problem, but I think it spoke to the level of ambition that they see for helping the people in some of these markets and the potential they see in these markets, right? And frankly, it clashes with this notion of that image of who needs help versus who wants to be empowered to be able to help themselves. And the second one is we hear a lot about things like food insecurity, famine in East Africa and so on, right? Again, this is kind of, until it hits the headlines, people will forget about it. We have another entrepreneur, Nihilist, they operate in Latin America in slums. They're looking to move into East Africa. And he was very clear. He said, look, we're looking at the I'm never sure of the exact number, but I think it's 1.6 billion people that are food insecure. That's our market. Those are the people we want to reach, right? And that level of ambition is kind of what inspires us to push of how far we want to go in this, and not in terms of incremental change. But it's those people that set that level of ambition that I think has really changed the course of how we're trying to solve this with these kind of groups as well.
And so if you're going to take one thing away from here today, it's change of mindset. It is not people you're going to do things for. There's a market out there, and how do we tap that market to provide us our solutions?
Awesome. It lies to me to thank all of you. You've been absolutely awesome. You are practitioners and conveners and enablers, and collectively you are going to transform fragile societies, rebrand them into the opportunity sets that they are, and think of them as frontier societies, not fragile ones. So thank you so much for everything you do.
And you're an awesome